All right, listener. Today's deep dive is going to be into this stack of articles you sent over, all about multi-jurisdictional compliance.
Yeah.
It sounds a little dry, I know. But trust me, this stuff gets surprisingly fascinating.
It is fascinating.
And relevant really quickly.
Yeah.
We're basically talking about how to make sure your business is playing by the rules, even when those rules change, depending on where you're operating in the world.
It really is like a puzzle where the pieces are always shifting because what is perfectly acceptable in one country might be completely against the law in another.
Exactly. And in today's globalized world, even small businesses can find themselves tangled up in this web of international regulations.
For sure.
I mean, think about it. You could be sourcing materials from one country,
Yep.
selling products online to customers in a totally different country, and then using a cloud storage provider in a third country.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets really interesting because the consequences of non-compliance can be pretty serious.
Yeah.
We're talking, fines, penalties, legal battles, and even damage to your brand's reputation, which is, really hard to recover from.
Yeah, that's a big deal. So let's say I'm a small business owner. Maybe I'm selling handmade jewelry online.
Okay.
Where do I even begin to figure out which regulations apply to me?
That is the million-dollar question because there is no one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately.
Okay.
It really depends on what you're selling,
Okay.
where you're selling it, where your business is based, where your data is stored.
Okay.
It's a whole host of factors.
All right, so this is where my head starts to spin a little bit.
Okay.
Can we break this down with like a real-world example?
Sure.
Like, what if I'm that jewelry maker and I'm collecting email addresses on my website to send out a newsletter?
Perfect example.
Yeah.
So let's say you're based in the U.S., but someone in the EU signs up for your newsletter. You are now subject to the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR.
GDPR, I've heard that one thrown around a lot, but honestly, I'm still a little fuzzy on what it actually means.
Okay.
What are the key things I need to know as a business owner?
Well, in a nutshell, GDPR is all about protecting the personal data of individuals in the EU.
Okay.
It gives people more control over their data, and it places strict obligations on businesses that handle that data.
So what kind of obligations are we talking about?
Yeah.
What would I need to do differently on my website to be GDPR compliant?
So first, you need to be super clear about what data you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and how you're going to use it.
Okay.
You can't just bury that information in some long, convoluted privacy policy.
Yeah, guilty as charged.
That nobody reads.
My current privacy policy is a copy and paste job.
Right.
So I need to be upfront with people about what I'm doing with your data.
Right.
What else?
You also have to give people the right to access, rectify, and erase their data. So basically, they can ask to see what data you have on them.
Okay.
Correct any inaccuracies or even request that you delete their data altogether.
So I can't just collect people's information and then sit on it forever.
Nope. Not under GDPR.
Wow. Individuals really have a lot more control over their personal data.
Yeah, they do.
And if you don't comply with these requirements, you're going to be facing some serious penalties.
You could, yeah.
Okay. I'm really starting to see how this can get complicated very quickly.
Yeah.
It's not just about common sense anymore.
No.
You really need to understand the specifics of all these regulations.
Absolutely. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've got a whole world of regulations to explore.
Okay.
Think of it like a legal travelogue.
I like that.
Each country with its own unique set of rules and customs.
Ooh, a compliance world tour. Where are we headed next on this adventure?
Let's jump over to the labor law jumble, where things can get pretty wild. What's considered a fair wage or acceptable working hours in one country might be totally different in another.
Right. I've heard stories about companies getting into trouble for outsourcing work to countries with lower labor standards.
Yeah.
But how does that apply to someone like me who's just running a small online business?
Well, even if you're not directly employing people overseas, you might be working with suppliers or contractors who are.
Okay.
And these days, there's an expectation that businesses take responsibility for the labor practices throughout their supply chain.
So even if I'm just one person, I need to be thinking about the ethical implications of where I'm sourcing my materials or who I'm contracting with.
Absolutely. Consumers are becoming a lot more aware of these issues, and they're demanding more transparency and accountability from the businesses they support.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I need to make sure I'm not inadvertently supporting unethical labor practices.
For sure.
This is definitely making me rethink my whole approach to business.
Good.
What other stops are on our world tour?
Let's not forget about the always thrilling topic of anti-bribery and corruption.
Okay.
This is where things can get really tricky because what might be considered a harmless gift in one culture could be seen as a bribe in another.
Ooh, yeah, that's a minefield I definitely want to avoid.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of how this might play out in real life?
Sure, imagine you're a company trying to secure a big contract in a foreign country,
Okay.
and you want to show your appreciation to the government official who's overseeing the bidding process.
Okay.
So you offer them a lavish gift.
Seems harmless enough.
Right, a gesture of goodwill, but depending on the country.
Okay.
And the specific circumstances, that gift could be considered a bribe under the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA.
FCPA, what's that?
Yeah, so the FCPA is a U.S. law that prohibits U.S. companies from bribing foreign officials to win business.
Okay.
It's been around for a while, but it's getting more attention these days as businesses become more global.
So even if I'm not a huge corporation, I still need to be aware of the FCPA if I'm doing business internationally.
You do, and it's not just about avoiding legal trouble.
Okay.
It's about operating ethically and building trust with your partners and customers around the world.
Right, because even if something's not technically illegal, it might still be ethically questionable. And that can damage your reputation just as much as a legal violation.
Absolutely. And speaking of complex regulations, we can't forget about everyone's favorite topic.
Taxes.
Ugh, taxes. I knew that was coming, but somehow it's still painful.
I hear you, but taxes are a crucial part of the compliance puzzle, especially when you're operating in multiple jurisdictions.
Okay, so what makes taxes so complicated on a global scale?
Right.
Is it just about different tax rates in different countries?
It's way more complicated than that.
Okay.
Each country has its own set of tax laws, reporting requirements, deadlines. You've got corporate income taxes, value-added taxes, withholding taxes, customs duties. It can get overwhelming very, very quickly. So if I'm selling my jewelry online to customers in multiple countries, do I need to figure out the tax laws in every single one of those countries?
Well, it depends on the specifics of your business model and the countries you're selling to. In some cases, you might be able to simplify things by registering for something called a value-added tax or VAT scheme in the EU, which allows you to collect and remit VAT on your sales across multiple EU countries.
Okay, so there are ways to streamline things.
There are.
But it sounds like I'm going to need some serious help navigating this tax maze. Maybe a team of international tax lawyers.
Well, it might not require a whole team of lawyers, but seeking professional guidance is definitely a smart move.
Okay.
A qualified tax advisor can help you understand the tax implications of your business activities and make sure you're compliant with all the applicable laws.
So we've toured through data protection land.
Yes.
Navigated the labor law jungle.
We have.
And tiptoed through the anti-bribery and corruption minefield. And now we've landed in tax territory. What a wild ride.
It is a lot to take in, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the good news is that there are ways to manage all this complexity.
Okay.
Effectively, you don't have to be a giant multinational corporation with a massive compliance department to stay on top of things.
That's what I want to hear. So how do companies actually build a system that can handle all of this? Where do you even begin?
Imagine you're constructing a global compliance fortress.
Okay, a fortress.
First, you need a blueprint.
Okay.
Right away to assess the lay of the land, identify potential risks.
So like a treasure map to help me find all the hidden compliance requirements before I stumble into them and get hit with a penalty.
Exactly. That's where a global compliance assessment comes in.
Okay.
It's basically a comprehensive audit of all the jurisdictions your business operates in, mapping out all the key regulatory requirements for each one.
Okay.
So it helps you answer the question, what rules do I need to worry about?
So it's like doing your due diligence on a global scale.
Yeah.
You wouldn't buy a house without an inspection.
Right.
And you shouldn't launch a global business without understanding the compliance landscape.
That is a great analogy.
And once you've got a good understanding of the risks, you can start to build your compliance structure. Think of it like laying the foundation for your compliance fortress.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do you structure a global compliance program?
Right.
Is it better to have a centralized team calling all the shots? Or should you empower local teams to handle compliance in their own regions?
That is the age-old debate, centralized versus decentralized.
Okay.
And there's no easy answer because each approach has its own pros and cons.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach?
So a centralized model offers consistency and control. You have one dedicated team setting global standards, making sure everyone's on the same page, and it can be more efficient and cost-effective, especially for smaller businesses.
That makes sense. But wouldn't it be difficult for a centralized team to stay on top of the nuances of every single jurisdiction?
You're right.
I mean, that's a lot of legal expertise to have in one place.
It is, and that's where a decentralized model can be advantageous. Local teams, they have a deeper understanding of the specific laws, cultural norms in their regions. They can adapt global policies to fit the local context and build relationships with local regulators and stakeholders.
Okay, but then wouldn't you risk having different standards in different places?
You would.
Creating inconsistencies and potentially opening the company up to more risk.
That's the trade-off.
Okay.
You gain local expertise, but you might sacrifice consistency and control. So what often works best is a hybrid approach.
Okay.
You set global standards centrally, but give local teams the flexibility to adapt them to their specific jurisdiction.
Okay, a hybrid approach. So it's like a global framework with local customization.
You got it.
Kind of like those clothing brands that offer basic designs, but let you add your own flair with different fabrics or embellishments.
I like that you're catching on quickly.
And speaking of making things easier, we can't forget about the role of technology in managing this global compliance puzzle.
Oh, technology is key here.
All right, I'm ready for the tech solutions.
Okay.
Tell me more. How can technology help companies stay on top of all these regulations?
Well, there's a whole world of compliance software out there that can be incredibly helpful.
Okay.
Especially for businesses operating in multiple jurisdictions.
Okay, so what can this software actually do?
Think of compliance software as your global command center.
Okay.
It can help you track regulatory changes, manage policies and procedures, monitor employee training, and even automate certain tasks.
So instead of drowning in spreadsheets, legal documents, and email chains, I can use software to centralize everything. And make it easier to manage.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder. And the best part is that compliance software is becoming increasingly accessible and affordable.
Okay.
Even for smaller businesses.
That's reassuring to hear. I was picturing some super expensive enterprise software that's only available to Fortune 500 companies.
No, not at all. There are solutions designed specifically for small and medium-sized businesses with features and pricing that fit your needs.
So we've got our global compliance assessment, our hybrid structure, and our trusty tech tools. What else do we need to conquer this compliance mountain?
Well, now it's time to put on our local explorer hats. And figure out how to make those global policies actually work on the ground.
Right. It's one thing to have a great plan on paper, but it's another thing to actually implement it effectively across different cultures and legal systems. And that's where I imagine things can get really tricky.
They can, and this is where having local experts on your team becomes absolutely crucial.
Local experts. Okay, so we're not just talking about lawyers anymore.
Well, lawyers are definitely part of the equation, but you might also need consultants, advisors, or even just local employees who have a deep understanding of the cultural nuances, business practices in their region.
So it's like having a local guide who knows all the hidden trails. And can help you avoid any unexpected pitfalls.
Exactly.
But how do you find these local experts? Is it through networking specialized consulting firms?
There are a lot of different avenues you can explore. Networking is definitely helpful, reaching out to industry associations, chambers of commerce in the countries you're operating in. And there are consulting firms that specialize in helping businesses navigate international compliance.
What if I'm a solopreneur or a small business owner? With a limited budget. Can I even afford this kind of guidance?
That's a great question, and it's a common concern for smaller businesses. But there are resources available to help, even if you're on a tight budget.
So I don't have to break the bank to get some expert advice. What are some of these resources?
Well, there are government agencies that provide guidance and support to businesses expanding internationally. For example, the U.S. Department of Commerce has a network of trade specialists around the world who can help you navigate the complexities of doing business in different countries.
So there's free help available from the government?
There is.
I had no idea.
Yep. And there are also online resources like webinars, articles, forums,
Okay.
where you can connect with other businesses and learn from their experiences.
So it sounds like there are options out there
There are.
for businesses of all sizes and budgets.
Absolutely. The key is to be proactive.
Mm-hmm.
And to do your research, don't wait until you're facing a compliance issue to start seeking help.
Right, because by then it might be too late. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got our global framework, our local experts.
Yeah.
What else do we need to consider when it comes to making those global policies actually work on the ground?
One thing that often gets overlooked is the importance of customization. You can't just take a policy that was written for one country
Right.
and expect it to work seamlessly in another.
Because different cultures have different norms and expectations. What might be considered perfectly acceptable behavior in one country could be seen as completely inappropriate in another.
Absolutely. So you need to tailor your policies to the local context,
Okay.
taking into account cultural sensitivities, language barriers, even things like local holidays and customs.
So it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot between global consistency and local adaptation.
You got it. And it requires a lot of communication and collaboration.
Yeah.
Between your global and local teams. You need to create a feedback loop so that local teams can share their insights and perspectives with the global team and vice versa.
Right. Because if you're not communicating effectively, you risk creating policies that are either too rigid or too lenient.
Right.
It sounds like striking that balance is key.
It is, absolutely. And it's an ongoing process. You need to constantly evaluate your policies and make adjustments as needed to make sure they're still effective and relevant.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. You need to be constantly reviewing and refining your approach to compliance.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to build a compliance culture within your organization.
Okay, a compliance culture. I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
All right.
What does a strong compliance culture look like?
It's about creating an environment where everyone understands the importance of compliance, feels empowered to speak up if they see something wrong. It's about moving beyond a check-the-box mentality and truly integrating compliance into the fabric of your business.
So it's about making compliance part of your company's DNA. Not just something you do because you have to, but something you do because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And it starts at the top.
Okay.
Leadership needs to set the tone and make it clear that compliance is a priority.
Right.
They need to walk the talk and demonstrate their commitment to ethical and compliant business practices.
Right. Because if employees see their leaders cutting corners or turning a blind eye to violations, they're less likely to take compliance seriously themselves.
For sure.
It sends the message that compliance is optional, not essential.
Exactly. It's about leading by example.
Okay.
And creating a culture of accountability. And it's about making sure that everyone in the organization understands their role in maintaining compliance.
So it's not just the compliance team's responsibility.
Right.
Everyone has a part to play.
Exactly. Compliance is everyone's responsibility.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this fits together. The policies, the training, the technology, the culture, it's all part of building a strong compliance ecosystem.
It is.
But even with all of these pieces in place, I imagine there are still challenges that pop up.
There are.
Especially in a world that's constantly changing.
For sure, the world of compliance is never static. New regulations are constantly being introduced. Existing laws are being updated. And the global business landscape is constantly evolving. So how do companies stay ahead of the curve in this ever-changing environment?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. It seems like you'd need a crystal ball to keep up with all the changes.
Well, a crystal ball would be nice, but unfortunately we don't have one of those. But what we do have are tools and strategies that can help us stay informed and adapt to change.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of these tools and strategies?
Well, it all starts with monitoring global regulatory changes. You need to have a system in place to track new laws, amendments, and court rulings that could impact your business.
Okay, that sounds daunting. I'm already feeling overwhelmed just thinking about keeping up with changes in my own country, let alone trying to track what's happening in dozens of others.
It is a lot to handle, but thankfully there are resources available to help.
Okay.
You can subscribe to regulatory update services, use compliance software that tracks changes, and even hire specialized consultants to keep you informed.
So it's about leveraging all the resources available to you technology expertise,
Mm-hmm.
and good old-fashioned research.
Exactly. And you can't just rely on external resources.
Okay.
You need to empower your own team as well.
Right, because even with the best tools and consultants,
Yeah.
it's your internal team that will ultimately be responsible for implementing and upholding compliance standards.
Absolutely. That's why ongoing training is so important.
Okay.
Your compliance team needs to be constantly learning and evolving, just like the regulatory landscape itself.
So it's not just about initial training when someone joins a team. It's about continuous learning and development throughout their career.
Exactly. You need to create a culture of learning
Okay.
where compliance is seen as an ongoing process, not a one-time event.
So we've got monitoring,
Mm-hmm.
training, any other secret weapons in the compliance arsenal.
One more crucial tool, scenario planning. It's like a what-if game
Okay.
for compliance.
Okay. I'm intrigued. How does that work?
You gather your team and think through potential changes
Okay.
that could impact your business. What if a new data privacy law is passed in a key market?
Mm-hmm.
What if there's a political upheaval in a country where you have a factory?
Uh-huh.
What if a new trade agreement changes the rules of the game?
So it's about anticipating potential challenges
Yeah.
and having a plan in place to adapt quickly,
Exactly.
kind of like a fire drill, but for compliance issues.
I like that the more you can anticipate and prepare for, the less likely you are to be caught off guard. When something unexpected happens, and trust me, unexpected things happen all the time
I bet.
in the world of global compliance.
So it's like having a playbook for different compliance scenarios.
Yeah.
So you're not scrambling to react in the heat of the moment.
Exactly.
You've already thought through the potential issues and you have a plan in place.
Precisely. It's about being proactive, not reactive. And that brings us to the part I always find most interesting. Real-world examples of companies successfully navigating
Right.
this complex landscape.
Okay. Hit me with some case studies.
All right.
I'm ready to see how all of this theory actually plays out in practice.
Let's start with a global tech company
Okay.
operating in both the EU and the US.
Right.
They were facing a major challenge complying with both GDPR, which we talked about earlier, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA.
CCPA, another one of those alphabet soup regulations. What's that one all about?
The CCPA is California's answer to GDPR.
Okay.
It gives California residents similar rights and protections when it comes to their personal data. So companies doing business in California, even if they're based elsewhere, need to comply with both GDPR and CCPA.
So this tech company had to navigate two of the strictest data privacy laws in the world.
They did.
That sounds like a compliance nightmare.
It was definitely a challenge, but they managed to create a system that worked in both places. How do you think they did it?
Well, based on what we've talked about so far, I'm guessing they used a hybrid approach to compliance,
Mm-hmm.
a centralized team setting global standards,
Yep.
but with local teams adapting those standards to meet the specific requirements of GDPR and CCPA.
You got it. They also invested heavily in technology,
Yep.
using data mapping tools and automated compliance software to streamline their efforts and ensure consistency across both regions.
Okay, that's a great example of how a company can successfully juggle multiple regulations without sacrificing efficiency.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of collaboration and communication between global and local teams. They need to work together seamlessly to ensure that global policies are implemented effectively at the local level.
All right, what other compliance success stories do you have for us?
Let's move on to a multinational manufacturing company with operations across Asia, Europe, and North America.
Whoa, that's a lot of ground to cover.
It is.
What were some of their biggest compliance challenges, and how did they manage to stay on top of it all?
Well, one of their biggest challenges was managing the complexity of their global supply chain.
Right.
They were sourcing materials from multiple countries, each with its own set of environmental and labor regulations.
So they couldn't just assume that their suppliers were meeting the same standards across the board?
No, they couldn't.
They needed to verify that everyone was playing by the rules, so to speak.
Exactly, and they also had to be mindful of cultural differences and language barriers. They couldn't just take a policy that was written in English and expect it to be understood and followed by workers in, say, Vietnam or China.
So how did they approach this challenge? Did they hire a team of translators and cultural sensitivity experts?
Well, translation and cultural sensitivity were definitely important considerations.
Okay.
But they also adopted a more decentralized approach to compliance.
Decentralized. So they empowered their local teams
Yes.
to take ownership of compliance in their respective regions.
Exactly. They realized that a one-size-fits-all approach simply wouldn't work.
Okay.
They needed to give their local teams the flexibility to adapt global policies to the specific needs and circumstances of their regions.
Okay, so they gave their local teams more autonomy?
Mm-hmm.
But how did they ensure consistency across all their locations?
Right.
Did they just trust that everyone would do the right thing?
Trust is important, but they didn't just leave it up to chance. They established a clear framework for global compliance,
Okay.
with core principles and standards that everyone had to adhere to.
So it was a hybrid approach,
It was.
just like the tech company we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Global standards with local adaptation.
Exactly, and they also used technology to help them manage the complexity.
Uh-huh.
They implemented a global compliance management system that allowed them to track compliance activities across all their locations, monitor progress, and identify potential issues in real time.
So they had a centralized system for tracking compliance.
Mm-hmm.
But they gave their local teams the autonomy to make decisions
Yes,
and adapt policies as needed.
that's right. And this hybrid approach proved to be very successful for them.
Correct?
It allowed them to maintain consistency
Mhm.
while also being responsive to local needs and challenges.
Okay, these are some really inspiring examples.
Yeah.
It shows that it's possible to build a successful global business while still upholding ethical and compliant practices.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that compliance isn't just about avoiding trouble. It's about building a sustainable foundation
Right.
for global success.
I love that.
It's about creating a business that is both profitable and responsible.
So listener, feeling a little more equipped to navigate the global compliance maze. It's complex, but it's also fascinating how companies are finding ways to thrive ethically
Absolutely.
in this interconnected world.
And before we move on to more specific advice and examples, I'm curious to hear what stands out to you from all this, listener.
Yeah.
What feels most relevant to your world?
I don't know about you, listener, but I'm already seeing compliance landmines everywhere.
Right.
Like, I suddenly feel very aware of where my data is stored and who might be accessing it.
It's amazing how quickly those light bulbs start going off once you start thinking about this stuff. And it's not just about big corporations. These issues can impact even the smallest of businesses.
Right, like that online course I'm thinking of launching.
Mm-hmm.
If I have students in the EU, I might need to think about GDPR compliance.
Exactly. Even something as simple as collecting email addresses for a newsletter can trigger compliance obligations.
Okay.
And speaking of those light bulbs, what else is standing out to you from our conversation so far?
Well, that manufacturing company you mentioned, the one with operations all over the world,
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear more about how they managed to build a compliance system that worked across so many different countries and cultures.
What's fascinating about their case is how they approached cultural differences.
Okay.
They realized that compliance isn't just about translating policies into different languages.
Uh-huh.
It's about understanding how different cultures perceive and respond to rules.
Ooh, that's a great point. So it's not just about the letter of the law, it's about the spirit of it, how it's actually lived out in different contexts.
Exactly. For example, in some cultures, there's a strong emphasis on deference to authority,
Okay.
which can make it really challenging to encourage employees to speak up if they see something wrong.
Right, because they might feel uncomfortable questioning their superiors or reporting potential violations. It could be seen as disrespectful or even insubordinate.
Exactly. So this company had to be really mindful of these cultural nuances when they were designing their compliance training programs and their communication strategies.
Okay.
They had to find ways to encourage open communication and reporting without violating cultural norms.
So they had to adapt their approach based on the specific cultural context of each region.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like traveling to a new country.
Yeah.
You need to learn about the local customs and etiquette to avoid any unintentional faux pas.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of having local experts on your team who can provide that cultural guidance.
Right.
They can help you understand those unspoken rules and expectations that might not be obvious to an outsider.
Right, because even with the best intentions, you can easily make mistakes if you don't understand the cultural context.
Yeah.
And this taste can have serious consequences, both for your business and for your relationships with local stakeholders.
Absolutely. It's about being respectful, being informed, and being willing to adapt. It's about recognizing that compliance isn't just about following a set of rules. It's about building trust and understanding across cultures.
So it's about more than just avoiding legal trouble. It's about building a foundation for ethical and sustainable business practices on a global scale.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that compliance is an ongoing journey, not a destination. The world is constantly changing, and so are the rules. So you can never just check the compliance box and move on.
Okay.
It's something you have to continuously monitor and adapt to.
Right, so you can never just rest on your laurels.
No.
You have to stay vigilant and be prepared to adjust your approach as needed.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to build a compliance culture within your organization.
Okay.
A culture where compliance is seen as everyone's responsibility, not just the compliance team's job.
Okay, tell me more about it. We touched on this earlier.
Yeah.
But I wanted to dive a little deeper. What does a strong compliance culture actually look like in practice?
It's about creating an environment where everyone understands the importance of compliance
Okay.
and feels empowered to speak up if they see something wrong.
Uh-huh.
It's about moving beyond a check-the-box mentality
Mm-hmm.
and truly integrating compliance into the fabric of your business.
So it's about making compliance part of your company's DNA.
Exactly.
Not just something you do because you have to,
Right.
but something you do because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And it starts at the top.
Okay.
Leadership needs to set the tone
Uh-huh.
and make it clear that compliance is a priority.
Right.
They need to walk the talk
Mm-hmm.
and demonstrate their commitment to ethical and compliant business practices.
Right. Because if employees see their leaders cutting corners
Yeah.
or turning a blind eye to violations, they're less likely to take compliance seriously themselves.
For sure.
It sends a message that compliance is optional, not essential.
Exactly. It's about leading by example and creating a culture of accountability. And it's about making sure that everyone in the organization understands their role in maintaining compliance.
So it's not just the compliance team's responsibility. Everyone has a part to play.
Exactly. Compliance is everyone's responsibility.
Okay.
From the CEO to the newest intern, everyone needs to understand the importance of ethical and compliant behavior.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all of this fits together. The policies, the training, the technology, the culture. It's all part of building a strong compliance ecosystem.
It is.
But even with all of these pieces in place, I imagine there are still challenges that pop up, especially in a world that's constantly changing.
You're absolutely right. The world of compliance is never static. New regulations are constantly being introduced. Existing laws are being updated.
Yeah.
And the global business landscape is constantly evolving. So how do companies stay ahead of the curve in this ever-changing environment?
That's what I'm wondering. It seems like you'd need a crystal ball to keep up with all the changes.
Well, a crystal ball would be nice, but unfortunately we don't have one of those. But what we do have are tools and strategies that can help us stay informed and adapt to change.
Okay. All ears. What are some of these tools and strategies?
Well, it all starts with monitoring global regulatory changes. You need to have a system in place to track new laws, amendments, and court rulings that could impact your business.
Okay, that sounds daunting. I'm already feeling overwhelmed just thinking about keeping up with changes in my own country, let alone trying to track what's happening in dozens of others.
It is a lot to handle, but thankfully there are resources available to help. You can subscribe to regulatory update services, use compliance software that tracks changes, and even hire specialized consultants to keep you informed.
So it's about leveraging all the resources available to you, technology expertise. And good old-fashioned research.
Exactly. And you can't just rely on external resources. You need to empower your own team as well.
Right, because even with the best tools and consultants, it's your internal team that will ultimately be responsible for implementing and upholding compliance standards.
Absolutely. That's why ongoing training is so important. Your compliance team needs to be constantly learning and evolving, just like the regulatory landscape itself.
So it's not just about initial training when someone joins the team. It's about continuous learning and development throughout their career.
Exactly. You need to create a culture of learning where compliance is seen as an ongoing process, not a one-time event.
So we've got monitoring training. Any other secret weapons in the compliance arsenal?
One more crucial tool, scenario planning. It's like a what if.
Okay, I'm ready for this final example. What kind of business are we talking about?
Let's talk about a company that's probably pretty familiar to you. A global coffee chain.
Coffee, now, this is something I can relate to, but I imagine even a cup of coffee gets complicated when you're talking about global compliance.
You'd be surprised. Think about it. They're sourcing beans from all over the world, each region with its own unique set of environmental and labor
Right.
regulations.
What might be considered sustainable farming in one country could be totally different in another.
Exactly. And then you add on things like fair trade practices,
Hmm.
working conditions for the farmers, making sure those delicious beans are actually making a difference in the communities where they're grown.
Suddenly, my morning latte feels a lot more complex. So how does a company even begin to manage all of that?
This particular company is interesting because they took a really hands-on approach. They knew that just setting rules from their headquarters wasn't enough.
Okay.
They had to get out there and embed themselves in those coffee-growing regions.
So instead of just saying follow these rules, they actually got involved on the ground.
Exactly. They built direct relationships with farmers and cooperatives working side by side to make sure they were meeting both global standards and those local requirements we talked about earlier.
So I'm picturing a compliance officer sipping coffee with a farmer in Costa Rica discussing sustainable farming techniques.
You're not far off. They realized that compliance wasn't just about audits and checklists, it was about building trust and understanding.
That makes sense. You can't just impose rules from afar. You have to work collaboratively to find solutions that work for everyone.
Right, and it wasn't just about the practicalities of farming. They also had to be really mindful of those cultural differences and how sustainability is perceived. What might be considered eco-friendly in one culture could be seen as wasteful or disrespectful in another.
So even something as seemingly simple as, say, composting might require a different approach depending on the local culture.
Exactly. They couldn't just assume their global sustainability program would translate seamlessly everywhere. They had to adapt their communication, their training materials, even the way they framed certain concepts.
Okay, so this coffee company is a great example of how to balance global consistency with local adaptation. But I imagine even with all that effort, there are still challenges. Like, how do you measure the impact of all this? How do you know if it's actually making a difference?
That's where data comes in. This company is really data driven. They track everything from the environmental impact of different farming methods to the economic well-being of the farmers they work with.
So they're not just relying on anecdotal evidence or feel-good stories. They're actually measuring the outcomes.
Yep. And they use that data to refine their approach to identify areas where they can do better and to prove to their customers and themselves that their efforts are making a tangible difference.
This is making me rethink my whole morning coffee routine. Suddenly, it feels like a lot more than just a caffeine fix.
Right. It's a reminder that even our small choices, like where we buy our coffee, can have a ripple effect across the world.
All right, listener. I hope you're feeling as inspired as I am by all these examples. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the complexity of global compliance. But these companies show that it's possible to build ethical, sustainable businesses that make a positive impact.
Absolutely. And it's not just about giant corporations. Even small businesses like the one you're building, listener, can embrace these principles.
Right? Whether you're sourcing materials, hiring contractors, or just collecting email addresses on your website, every decision has compliance implications.
Exactly. And every step you take toward greater ethical awareness and responsibility makes a difference.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up our global compliance adventure.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder, listener.
Okay, hit us with that parting wisdom.
As you navigate the complexities of multi-jurisdictional compliance, remember that it's not just about avoiding risk. It's about creating a legacy of ethical and sustainable business practices.
I love that it's about building a better future for your company, for your stakeholders, and for the world.
Exactly. So keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to make a positive impact.
And remember, listener, we're all in this together. Let's support each other on this journey toward a more ethical and sustainable global business landscape.
Until next time, stay curious and stay compliant.